My mother, sister, and I used to live in these bright pink apartments near the corner of 35th Street and Brookdale Avenue in Oakland, California. At the time, the area was a prominently black neighborhood, and today the apartments have changed to a beige color, and the demographics have kind of changed as well. Some of my earliest memories of being socially racialized and not even realizing at the time was at these apartments. I remember playing with the neighbors' kids, and one of their mothers would come out yelling their name. A couple of those times, they would see me and add, "Get away from that white girl." I remember being so confused, looking around, not realizing I was who they were talking about. Even in grade school, I felt my mixed race identity was always in question. I remember having a teacher who didn't believe I was half Chinese, and sometimes being punished less because I was lighter skinned. Many of my peers would also say they were my friends in private, but would later tell me in one way or another that they couldn't be my friend anymore because we weren't the same race or color. Even in my Chinese side of my family, the only half I've ever known would remind me of being half white, saying things like, "You dance like a white girl," and "You eat like a white person," were common things told to me. Throughout my life, I've had my race communicated in overt and covert ways, all the while my multiraciality being constantly put into question. What was just seen is one of many accounts of how race is socialized and reinforced through communication. In this short, introductory, educational style film, I will be using similar autoethnographic accounts like the one just viewed to explore what is multiraciality by defining the concepts of identity and race in America and how these concepts contribute to our understanding of multiraciality. Then, we will briefly review how a slightly newer and emerging theory known as Critical Multiracial Theory, or MultCrit, is being used in communication to shift away from America's monoracial views within research. Before answering what is multiraciality, it's imperative to explain two key terms. The first is identity, which is a complex and fluid sense of who we are as individuals and as members of social groups. Identities are socially created and can be self-identified or socially prescribed to us, and can be associated with a set of beliefs, values, and communicative practices. Some examples of identities could be your gender, religion, and nationality. They can also be based on your familial, academic, and racial backgrounds. The concept of race is a socially constructed group or groupings or categorizing of people by phenotypic features and shared histories as defined by a dominant governing system. Consider the demographics section of many surveys and questionnaires such as FAFSA or the US Census. The race-based questions often restrict participants' choices to selecting only one racial identity or limiting the racial options to general monoracial groupings such as Asian or Hispanic. The options two or more races or other are not always listed and is still a relatively newer practice for some researchers. Race as an identity or racial identity is socially communicated to us by family, friends, and strangers alike. The socialization of a racial identity is typically positioned within monoracial terms. For individuals who identify as multiracial, mixed race, or having two or more racial identities, are faced with navigating this monoracial world. Multiraciality refers to a mixed race individual's lived racialized reality and experiences. What are you? That's the most common question I'm asked when meeting new people. It comes in the middle of the sentence. Sometimes it's the first question that they'll say in meeting me. What are you? Most of the time, I'll answer the question by explaining that how I'm mixed, that I'm half second generation American Chinese and the other half some type of Ohio Caucasian mix. And I was mostly raised by my Chinese side of the family and a diverse mix of pseudo family members made up of my mom's friends. Most people then respond to me with, "Ah, I saw it in your eyes," or share their familial lineage or heritage with me. And on the rare occasions, I might get a person who asks, like, how do I know if my dad was Caucasian or white? And I tell them, I don't know much about my father or his side of the family because he left when I was about 1 year old. But photos of him show a tall, green eyed white guy with dirty blonde hair, and my family always said that he identified as being white. For the most part, I don't mind sharing information about my multiracial identity. It's just the question, what are you, often makes me feel like I'm kind of very different from the rest of society. And that could be a little off putting sometimes. To explain MultiCrit, we start by looking at critical race theory, or CRT, which emerged in the 1970s-80s. CRT was developed by a group of Wisconsin civil rights lawyers, focused on addressing racial reform and structural inequities. CRT scholar Gloria Ladison Billings explains that CRT is about deploying race and racial theory as a challenge to traditional notions of diversity and social hierarchy. She further explains a second aspect of CRT is the use of storytelling to challenge racial and other oppression. The following are 4 of the most commonly identified tenets of CRT. Tenet 1 is challenge to a historicism, which insists on analyzing issues of race and racism in a historical and contemporary context. Tenet 2 is interest convergence, which transpires when gains in racial equity are advanced only when it benefits white people. Tenet 3 is experiential knowledge, that encourages a focus on experiential knowledge that centers the voices of marginalized populations. Tenet 4 is challenge to dominant ideology, that challenges traditional claims that uphold the status quo, such as meritocracy and the facade of not seeing color. This is where scholars have employed other theoretical lenses, such as intersectionality and racial microaggressions, to question dominant ways of thinking. One of the major drawbacks to CRT is its monoracial approach that innately excludes multiracial populations. This led to the birth of Harris's 2016 development of Critical Multiracial Theory, or MultiCrit. In 2016, Jessica Harris published an article focused on repositioning CRT ideologies through a multiracial perspective she dubbed as a critical multiracial theory, or MultiCrit. Other scholars have referenced MultiCrit as critical multiple races theory and critical multiple racial identity theory, depending on the field of study. Harris's 2016 article outlined 8 major tenets of MultiCrit theory. For all intended purposes, we'll be covering the first 4 tenets, which maintain the same tenet titles as CRT. The first tenet, challenge to historicism, asserts that structural determinism shifts need to consider America's monoracialism. For example, America's historical rule of hyperdescent, or the monoracial assignment of a person's racial identity, is still a prevalent practice within many social and structural systems. Consider how the racial biases of healthcare providers can affect the health of their mixed-race patients. For me, I find my race is not commonly asked, but assumed and changed to white. This has caused conflicts with the management of my care, as some medications have reported side effects for specific racial groups, such as anti-seizure medications for Asians. The second tenet looks at interest convergence, as a means to reveal the ways multiracial individuals may be exploited by monoracial paradigms. Think about how the media portrays a racially mixed person. A celebrity or public figure's multiraciality often challenges society's racial assumptions and even conflicts with dominantly held beliefs about racial identities. The third tenet, experiential knowledge, centers multiracial people's voices as well as challenges dominant ideologies concerning race and multiraciality. Historically, racial identities have been viewed through a monoracial perspective, where individuals have been deemed as an outgroup member, racially stereotyped, criminalized, and/or misrepresented. Researchers found many multiracial individuals encounter conflicts with their racial representations of identity when it doesn't match an intergroup's racial views. The fourth tenet looks to challenge dominant ideologies, looks at how multiracial voices could be elevated to disrupt traditions or the status quo. Also, to forefront the multiraciality of mixed-race individuals' experiences and challenge monoracial perspectives through communication. Researchers use this tenet to look at how messages racially socialize our identities and are experienced differently for a mixed-race individual, such as a biracial child. How multiple racial identities can conflict and are navigated. How a multiracial person's lived experiences, encounters, can be negatively impacted by racial stigma. Some studies using this tenet have done so in conjunction with intersectionality and microaggression theory to critically analyze multiraciality within communication. In the field of communication studies, there is still a limited amount of research focused on examining the multiracial. Within this film, I encourage future researchers to consider using Critical Multiracial Theory, or MultCrit, to help provide space and recognition that gives a bigger voice to this understudied population of people who reside within the liminal spaces of America's racial binaries.